good morning, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us in this Zoom meeting. That means that you should be able to see each other if you turn your cameras on. Please keep your mics silent, though, whilst the main presentation is going on. But also, Zoom meeting gives us the opportunity to say hi to people if you can see them in the participants. So please do get chatting, and let's try and make this a festive celebration of our lovely business community. Thanks so much for joining us. I'm Sarah Lethbridge. I'm now the Pro Dean of External Engagement. This is very exciting, everybody. Pro Dean sounds amazing, and hopefully I'm going to be able to do more and more of these sorts of activities to make sure that our business community feels connected with the wonderful research of Cardiff Business School and the wider university. If you've got any points or questions or ideas, then please do drop me a line. That would be great. There's my contact details there. Speech to text captioning is available for this event, so you can click the closed caption button on your screen. If you could keep your mics muted, that would be fantastic, just so that there's no feedback. But yeah, get looking at the speech to text captioning that provided by Julia. It's really helpful, I find. So thanks so much, Julia, for providing that for us. Just a little flag for our future programmes. We've got our Lean Six Sigma. You can still get the early bird discount, everybody. There's the code there, EE622, if you want to take advantage of that brilliant programme with Professor Manish Kumar. And also, we're now in programme cohort 3 of our Help to Grow programme. It's a really fantastic, heavily funded programme. The opportunities that you're given on that programme are amazing. If you're interested in that, if you're an SME with a few employees looking to grow, please do contact Linda hellardl@cardiff.ac.uk, and she'll help you to register and sort out everything for you. This event is being recorded. Please get busy in the chat. As I said, it'd be really lovely to hear your questions to Polly and Isabel. I think that's it from me, actually, but I just wanted to say that I'm very excited about this breakfast briefing, mainly because I saw a tweet on Twitter about the wonderful campaign that I'd seen out in the Cardiff streets, trying to stop people dropping chewing gum in Cardiff. And they'd cleverly used some very gorgeous kittens who had their little paws stuck in chewing gum. And I was like, this is the sort of breakfast briefing that I need to hear more about. So I'm so grateful to Isabel and Polly. I reached out to them and they said, yeah, sure, we'll tell you all about the campaign. And now they're going to do that with us today. So over to you guys, Polly Garland, Izzy Romilly from Behaviour Change. It's a organisation based in London who help lots of different organisations to embrace behaviour change to make a difference. So over to you. Thanks ever so much for joining us.
Great, thanks so much, Sarah. I'm just going to share my screen, so just let me know if this works. Cool, all good?
Yeah, brilliant.
Great, great. Well, thanks very much, Sarah. And I promise that we will be coming back to the kittens to explain those in a little bit more detail a bit later on in the talk. But yeah, it's really nice to be here this morning. Thank you so much for having us. So as you probably already know, we're going to be giving you a very brief introduction to our take on behaviour change. And we're specifically going to look at the importance of insight in that process and just generally getting real about human behaviour. And we're going to do that via a couple of short case studies from over the years. So a bit more of an introduction. Hello, so Polly and I both here from Behaviour Change. We are an 11-year-old not-for-profit. We work with a really wide range of partners, from businesses and charities to government and foundations, to tackle any kind of social or environmental challenge that has a behavioural element to it. And we do that via big ideas grounded in behavioural science. So we're not... so we're not scientists, we're practitioners. So this is very much our kind of working take on what the kind of field of behavioural science can tell us about, applying kind of what they've learned to challenges that are in the real world. So presumably everyone can read this. I have a bit of a guess. Feel free to turn your mic off and say what you think is going on here. Any guesses? Sorry, I can't see the chat, so.
Yeah, we've got a response there from Anna saying good times here. So.
Cool. So unfortunately, I'm very sorry, Anna, you're a little bit wrong about that. So we really like this little kind of visual example because I think it's a really good example of the way that our brains do a lot of the thinking automatically for us. They fill in a lot of gaps without us ever really thinking about it. There were so many possibilities for what could have been under that blue line, but we just kind of knew via previous experience what was probably there. But in this case, obviously, it was slightly misled. Another example, so I tried Googling this last night to find out what I should have this morning to fuel me for this. You should see that if you type this into Google, you get a number of results so big that I'm not actually sure how to say that. I think that's 2 trillion. Similarly, there's that much quoted stat that, even in a typical supermarket with a few thousand lines, the average person only ever buys about 150 of them. So as humans, we need ways of navigating decision making that make that process a lot more efficient for us. A quote that we use a lot is that humans are good at thinking, but humans are to thinking as cats are to swimming. We can do it when we have to, but we'd much rather not. And so we have all of these ways of saving ourselves time and getting to decisions a little bit faster. So we like to think of ourselves as kind of rational beings, and we like to think that we're really kind of in control and that we really make all of the decisions that we make. But in reality, a lot of the things that we do actually don't really happen within our conscious control or awareness. We're quite inconsistent. We make a lot of different decisions that are really heavily influenced by context, noise, habit, and common behavioural tools like social norms and defaults are just 2 examples of that. And of particular interest to us, because we work on social and environmental challenges, is that we regularly do things that are against our own interests and the interests of society in general. So, for example, we do a lot of work on sustainability, which is a really good example of that. So you may well have come across the idea of System 1 and System 2 thinking. That's an idea that was popularised by Daniel Kahneman in his book, Thinking Fast and Slow. So the idea is that System 1 is this kind of fast, instinctive, automatic process that kind of happens without a lot of kind of conscious input. And System 2 is this kind of slower, deliberative, more reflective process, which is the kind of thinking that we only really do when we have to. So we have lots of these kind of mental shortcuts to help us, navigate life. So rules of thumb, which when they lead to mistakes or, kind of cognitive likelihood of doing something, we call them biases. A lot of our decisions are determined by habits. So we do a lot of things automatically. We repeat them, particularly in certain contexts where a habit is kind of triggered by the environment, which are normally useful, but as we all know, bad habits can be really hard to break. There's noise. So noise is the random kind of variability of judgments, the inconsistency that's caused by these irrelevant external factors that could be as simple as being in a bad mood, being hungry. So, one example of that is that there's a lot written about, judges and sentencing and how much kind of personal mood and, noise plays in kind of sentencing decisions. And, possibly most importantly, context as well. So our behaviour is really closely connected to the world around us, who's around us, where we are, and the kind of environment that we're in. So what does this mean for us when we're approaching a behaviour change challenge? So firstly, unfortunately, and possibly the kind of most important principle from behaviour change is that unfortunately, knowledge doesn't equal action. So knowledge can have a really important role to play where a lack of knowledge has been identified as an important barrier, but knowledge on its own actually doesn't really help people do things or act on that knowledge. So a lot of traditional communications and campaigns are based on the idea that if we give people more information, they will then be able to make better decisions. And again, knowledge can be an important factor, but it's definitely not the only thing. And unfortunately, simply giving people information is not a good kind of predictor of whether or not they'll be able to act on that information. So our kind of second principle is that attitude doesn't equal action either. And it may actually be that our attitudes follow our actions rather than the other way around. So for example, in 2019, we conducted some research into citizen attitudes to various like climate issues, and that added to the mounting evidence that people in the UK are increasingly concerned about single-use plastic, but that certainly didn't correlate with a drop in purchases of single-use plastics. So it's really hard to kind of live out the kind of attitudes and values that we have. So unfortunately, I think this one's probably really relatable for all of us. Unfortunately, kind of intention doesn't equal action either. Again, it can be an important part of the picture, but we all know how easy it is that we've set plans to do something, and for whatever reason we're knocked off track and those don't go ahead. I think, again, what this kind of all boils down to is that we really need to focus on what people actually do in the real world and not what they think or what they feel. So at a very early stage, we need to think really carefully about whether the objective that we're working on involves changing people's behaviour, which it usually does, or whether changing how they think or feel is an important part of that. And just, ensuring that for impact, people need to be doing something differently rather than just thinking or feeling something differently. So one of the strongest lessons that comes out of behavioural science is really simple. It's just make it easy as possible. Whatever behaviour you want people to do, just focus on making that as easy as you possibly can for people to engage with. So think about things like reducing steps, reducing friction. If you are providing information, it should be as simple and as intuitive as possible. This picture here, it's not one of our pictures or, of one of the National Trust areas, but we created a campaign with the National Trust that was 50 things to do before 11 3/4, that was all about helping parents spend more time outdoors with their kids. So a lot of parents want to do that anyway. A lot of them feel bad for not doing more of that. And so this campaign was created to facilitate people spending more time outdoors as families, by actually giving them kind of practical help rather than just kind of telling them something that they already knew. In general, at Behaviour Change, we tend to think of behavioural tools as falling into two big categories, which are, making things easier or adding pressure. I think the word pressure could be a little bit misleading here. We're not talking about kind of forcing people to do anything. It's not pressure in that sense, but just creating environments where there is a kind of natural expectation or kind of push for people to do a certain thing. So for an example, this is an intervention that we tested in a local park in South London, which added just a little bit of pressure to the environment to encourage people not to litter. And we wanted to do that in a really kind of humorous, light-hearted way. A lot of littering communications can be really, negative and kind of finger wagging. And we wanted to avoid that. And so we used this idea of gnomes as the kind of guardians of the natural world, to, exert a little bit of almost emotional pressure on people to look after the environment. And that turned out to be really effective and reduce littering by kind of 50% in some areas of the park. And again, I think we just have to think really realistically and in quite a kind of grounded real world way about how and where we kind of talk to people or interact with people. And so that is often about being in the right place at the right time. So thinking about where people are most receptive to change, where people are, naturally placed to actually be able to act on a prompt. So as we're going to come back to in a bit more detail later, if you want people to litter less, actually, it seems so obvious, but the right place to do that is out and about when there's a bin where they can actually act on that. And again, a lot of behavioural interventions are not just comms or campaigns, but if you're delivering, communications, often those are either out of home or digital. And so again, kind of thinking about how and where people are going to receive these kind of prompts and messages is quite important. So we've already mentioned that kind of research is really important to us. This is our kind of process, our project process, which we adapt for every challenge that we're working on. And for the rest of this talk, we're going to talk a bit more about this second stage, insight, through a couple of case studies. So we rely really heavily on research to gain, an in-depth real world understanding of the kind of barriers and enablers when it comes to a specific behaviour change challenge. So this really helps us get past any assumptions that we might have about that behaviour going into it. It helps us define what exact behaviour we're actually talking about. A lot of the time we talk about behaviours in much more general terms than is actually helpful. So an example that we often reach for here is food waste. Saying, let's waste less food, that is actually not a behaviour in itself. But actually the process of wasting food is made up of so many smaller behaviours that all happen at different times in different places. Is it about buying too much? Is it cooking too much? Is it defrosting too much? Is it serving too much? All of those kinds of things. Is it these kind of surprise meals that people, getting an unexpected takeaway, all of those types of things. So, we need to think very kind of specifically about the actual behaviour that we're trying to change, rather than seeing a kind of abstract pot of behaviours as the kind of specific thing that we're trying to tackle. So we begin a lot of our projects with new research, which is usually qualitative, because that tends to be the kind of piece of the picture that's missing, but it's not always. So I'm going to hand over to Polly, who joined us from Mars Wrigley, who's going to talk a bit more about the kitten that kind of originally Sarah saw on Twitter.
I was on mute there, classic. So as Isabel said, I used to work actually for Mars Wrigley and then came over to work for Behaviour Change. So I kind of sat I'm with both hats on in this project. At Mars Wrigley, obviously, we produced Wrigley chewing gum, and we'd been working for many years on anti-litter campaigns. It's an issue that is seen around the world as such, but actually the UK is fairly unique in its chewing gum issues, in that it seems to be recognised more as a problem. That's not to say we've got more gum on our streets than any other countries, but for some reason other countries don't seem to be quite so upset by the sight of it. So anyway, we in the UK are seen as a test bed for a lot of interventions, because we have the most pressure on us to try and clean up the litter. So we've been working for years on anti-litter campaigns, but a lot of it was all just around communications, and as Isabel was saying earlier, around raising awareness, but that wasn't getting the cut through and actually creating the behaviour change. So my old boss was at an event where she met the founders of Behaviour Change, and they got talking and were, you know, this is a really interesting piece we'd love to help you with. So yeah, so if you go on to the next slide, please, Isabel. Basically what we realised is that is it going really slow?
Sorry, yeah, I don't know why. When I change slides, it's often a bit of a delay. Sorry about that.
That's all right. So yeah, we challenged them to kind of come back to us and say, look, are we looking at this right? We've got we had a lot of assumptions that there were certain people that were littering. So the assumption was, you know, it was young people, it was antisocial people, that they dropped all their gum constantly. And, you know, we were always focusing on that group with our communications. And so one of the first challenges that Behaviour Change had was to go out and actually do some research and really understand who is it that's dropping the litter. And why do they do it? And you know, as Isabel was saying, it's that piece of understanding the actual, what is the actual action, what is actually happening and why is it happening, because that's what you can tackle, rather than just telling people don't drop your litter, because we all know it's not right to drop your litter. So why is it actually happening? I think it's back over to you, isn't it, Isabel?
Oh, sorry, a bit of a delay here.
That's
cool,
all right.
Thanks, Polly. Yeah, so with that challenge in mind, we set out to do new qualitative research into the issue, and very much in contrast to this idea that there is this small antisocial group of people who litter their gum all of the time, found out that is absolutely not the case and is a really unhelpful way of looking at the problem. So this is our kind of research sample. It's people from, you know, all walks of life, lots of different types of jobs, many of them kind of very socially conscious in lots of ways. And people who all confessed to littering their gum in kind of specific circumstances. And so one of our major findings was that people who admit to littering gum don't litter all of their gum. There's actually only 2 people in this sample who, you know, littered the majority of it. And actually for most people, they, you know, more of their gum went in the bin than it went on the floor. And so actually what that kind of led us to was the idea that it's not necessarily about people's, you know, whether people were like predisposed to littering or not, but it was more about people being in specific circumstances that triggered littering. And actually it turned out that those circumstances were quite, you know, helpfully, they were quite predictable across, you know, across locations. So things like public transport and travel, those transition moments when people are getting on or off a train, or they're waiting for a bus, and they're kind of, you know, they're transitioning from one part of a journey to another. People having food and drink on the go, that, you know, that makes sense. People are chewing gum either before or after, and then getting rid of it with quite a lot of kind of urgency a lot of the time. And then these kind of other out and about situations. Nightlife is a bit of a unique one because there's a lot of other things going on there to do with, you know, drinking, and it's dark and all those kinds of things. Cut-throughs, I think, are interesting because I think, you know, we found that people feel a bit better about littering in a kind of alleyway type location because it's a bit neglected anyway.
I think it's just worth adding in there. Sorry, you mentioned urgency, but I think that was one of the things that was quite, I wouldn't say surprising to Mars, because when you think about it, it's obvious, but gum litter is very different to other litter in that, you know, you finish your bar of chocolate and you have the wrapper in your hand, but you can just put that in your pocket. You don't have to find a bin immediately. Whereas gum, when you finish chewing it, I'm sure we've all had that experience where you kind of, it loses all of its flavour, it starts to go a bit hard and you want rid of it then and there. And you can't just, unless you've got a wrapper in your pocket of some sort, you can't just put it in your pocket. And that's where that kind of urgency piece comes in.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, because I think, you know, as we discovered through this, gum littering is a really unique type of littering from a behavioural point of view. There's all sorts of things going on with it that don't apply to other types of littering. So, you know, urgency is one thing, but also, you know, the kind of hygiene issue, you know, people touching, you know, you've got to touch your mouth to take it out, all of those kinds of things. And so, yeah, our key finding from all of this was that, as already mentioned, most litterers don't actually litter all of their gum, and actually the circumstance and the situation has a huge impact on whether or not people are going to litter it. Another really important finding was that people already know, like Polly said, that littering gum is you know, kind of wrong, it's bad, and actually they're really aware of that, and they often actually act to mitigate that. So there's often an attempt to litter gum in the most like pro-social way possible, which sounds, you know, a bit contradictory, but it is how, you know, people felt about it. And so that often meant, you know, putting a bit of gum underneath a table or something, you know, so that someone wouldn't step in it, which is obviously still not a good thing to do, but they felt they were doing something a bit better than dropping it on the floor. And I think, you know, what was really important is that this was genuine new news compared to this like previous assumption that there was this kind of antisocial group of people who litter all the time. And if we hadn't invested in doing new qualitative research to work out a new approach and actually talk to people about the problem, we would never have known that. And so there were a lot of options. Maybe this is something that, you know, Polly could say a bit more about. There were a lot of options in terms of what Mars could have done with this information. But it felt like, you know, the right route, the right strategy was therefore to be in the right place and help people do the right thing more often by, you know, being on street and creating these on-street interventions that prompted people to use bins in a particular moment based on those kind of circumstances that were discovered in the research. Is there anything you wanted to add to that, Polly, or shall I?
No, I think that's fair. You know, we very much took the lead from you guys as well as to, you know, what interventions could work. I think, you know, from a business point of view, we wanted something visible and something that was going to take action. But as you'll see when we show some of the artwork, one of the things we didn't do was brand it, because we weren't actually interested in, it wasn't an advertising piece, it wasn't trying to sell more gum, it was literally, we wanted it to be a very cutthroat message of stop littering your gum, and it didn't matter whether it was our gum or anyone else's. It was just a case of let's pin down that one behaviour.
Great. So we started thinking about the kind of behavioural tools, and I think again the really key one was just to make sure that we were being in the right place at the right time. I'll just say a little bit about affect and salience as well. So affect is the idea that we can kind of, you know, we can use emotion in some way, and that's where the Cardiff kitten came in. And people, you know, bizarrely respond much better to the idea, or I suppose it's not bizarre, but people respond much better to the idea of a cat being, you know, hurt by gum than they do, you know, people in general, or the environment in general, or the kind of, you know, the look of the area or anything like that. And so using a kitten in that situation, that turned out to be our kind of, I think, our second most effective artwork that we tried, and that reduced gum littering by 60% as a rate over about 3 months and beyond. So, and you know, yeah, so salience as well. So salience is the idea in behavioural science that, you know, things need to be kind of relevant and novel, and so that is something that we used on bins. Another very common thing that people say about littering is that, oh, I couldn't see a bin. And if you can kind of get around that and kind of undercut that by, you know, creating a kind of no excuses type intervention that still feels like it's quite upbeat and positive, then that is really helpful. So I'll hand back to you, Polly.
Yeah, so but we, like I say, Behaviour Change put to Mars various different interventions that we could consider, and so we decided what we would do is we'd take a lot of them and actually run a pilot. So let's take these ideas, let's go out into some cities and some areas where we've got the problem, and let's trial these ideas and see what the results are. So we worked with research companies to actually, one of the things was also to work out how do you actually measure gum littering. So we worked with them to get a real true measure of littering rate, and that's not just a case of you need to compare not just what's on the ground and how much more there is, but also put that with footfall. So if you've got an increase in footfall, you would expect to see somewhat of an increase in littering, and you're trying to work out that calculation to actually get a true understanding of how you're affecting the littering rate. But anyway, we ran these trials, and this is a selection of some of them, and you can see the kitten up there that we've mentioned that was running Cardiff. But yeah, amazingly, I mean, I think we were all somewhat surprised at how effective it was. And we were seeing reductions in litter of up to 64% on some of these. And just to compare that, we've been running at Mars, along with the whole of the chewing gum industry in conjunction with DEFRA, we'd been running a programme called the Chewing Gum Action Group, and that was all just around just general awareness campaigns, and we would see 20 to 30% reductions in litter when those were running. So to see something this effective was groundbreaking. So and from a business point of view, to get these across the line, this was looked at a UK level. It needs approval at EU level. It even went up to global, and there's so many moving parts to things. In fact, the kitten originally was a puppy, and we had to then go as a business like, well, actually, no, we can't do that because chewing gum's really dangerous for dogs. In fact, chewing gum is poisonous to dogs. So it's like, we have to look at those wider messagings as well, and how it all pulls together for the business. But yeah, so that's some of the ideas, and I can see different ways of using those tools. So like Isabel was saying, sometimes people say they don't know where the bin is. Well, that some examples here of actually trying to highlight, look, the bin's over there, go and use it. Or there's this many bins, and really trying to make them more visible. So yeah, we've scaled that up. That from the success of that, we've gone, well, this is brilliant. Let's make these available to everyone. So Mars have put the money behind this being a free toolkit that all local authorities nationwide and business improvement districts can use. And I think someone's already put a link actually in the chat where the councils can go to the site, request materials, and they are printed and sent out to them free of charge, or Mars funds that to be sent out, and so they can run the campaigns in their local authorities in their local areas and to help reduce gum littering. And it's been incredibly successful. We've had really good feedback all the way through, and we've now reached a point that actually it's been so successful, and we're still working very closely with DEFRA and the likes of Keep Britain Tidy to try and improve the situation nationwide. There's continued pressure from the government to reduce gum littering, and there's a continued pressure to, there's a continued threat of a gum tax. And one of the ways that we're working on that is that recently Mars Wrigley have now been told they need to pay, well, the whole gum industry have told they need to pay towards the cost of cleanup. And the success of this programme has actually enabled us to say, well, okay, look, we will pay for cleanup, but we won't do it unless this programme is part of it, because we recognise that you can't just clean it up and be done. That doesn't get rid of the problem. You need that behaviour change piece with it for it to actually have a long-lasting effect. So this programme is now going to become run by the whole industry, not just Mars Wrigley. It will be funded by the whole chewing gum industry.
Great. So we will just finish off with one more very quick case study. So we worked with the Northumbrian Water Group to tackle the lovely problem of sewer blockages. So NWG kind of came to us with this recurrent problem that they were getting a lot of flushed wet wipes stuck in their pipes, causing blockages and flooding, and just costing absolutely millions annually. So that this is obviously a challenge that has a real kind of behaviour change element to it, because it's caused by people kind of flushing something that they shouldn't. But we also know that just thinking about that kind of right time, right place principle, flushing wet wipes is, it's a hard thing to tackle, because this is something that's used in the most private room in the house. It's not something, that is very necessarily, you know, somewhere where you can easily kind of reach people and kind of be there in that moment when they're about to flush a wet wipe is obviously quite difficult. And so we knew a lot from NWG about what ends up in the sewers, probably kind of far more than we ever thought we would know about what gets, you know, ends up in sewer pipes. But we didn't actually have a lot of insight into why. And so our research for Mars Wrigley was all about qualitative research, but this was actually a project where we used quant research to find out more. So there was this starting assumption that the most common use of wet wipes was for baby changing. And so quant research into the issue actually showed us that that wasn't true. And actually the top use was for makeup removal, which created a kind of another avenue that of potential intervention strategies that NWG could go down. And I think did actually go down in terms of, you know, using kind of makeup influencers to encourage people to either switch to more kind of sustainable, reusable options, but also, you know, to make sure that if, you know, makeup wipes were not being flushed as well. But I think even more importantly than that, our research showed us that actually more than half of households don't have a bin in their bathroom. And again, something we just never would have known without kind of asking that question and trying to be in the right place at the right time. And so we piloted 2 interventions into kind of particularly bad hotspot areas for blockages. And so that happened in 2 stages. So firstly, we actually bought a load of bathroom bins and we gave them to people completely for free, to anyone who didn't have a bin in their bathroom. And then we followed that up with using blockages as a kind of local moment of change and making that really, you know, relevant and kind of salient for people. So there was on-street signage, you know, kind of engineers are clearing a blockage on your street today. You know, face-to-face outreach, door knocking, talking to people about the problem. And then as a last resort, following that up with these hard-hitting letters, which use visuals of specific blockages from specific homes to make that problem really, you know, relevant to people. And amazingly, we saw a kind of 50% reduction in blockages in both of those pilot areas. And again, we felt that, you know, having the kind of bathroom bin issue was really key. And had we kind of gone straight in with an awareness campaign about the problem, that would not have actually helped us identify one of the real issues and kind of tackle that in a very kind of real world way. So that is all from us. I think it's Q&A time.
Brilliant, so interesting, thank you. Can we see all the companies that you've worked with there? I think it's
sure.
Oh, there we go, there it is.
My
oh,
screen
brilliant.
is freezing every time I change slides. Sorry, it's taking a bit of a minute. I hope you can see that.
So that was so interesting, thanks. And I particularly love, you know, if people haven't got bathroom bins, give them a bin and that will change behaviour. I think that's so powerful.
Definitely cheaper than clearing blockages. So
yeah. And I also love the shame. Is it shame an okay word to say? The shaming of blockage clearance.
In general, we try and take quite a kind of positive approach to a lot of things, but I think as kind of last resort, I think those letters saying, you know, we can see what's in your sewer, you know, I think were quite effective.
Oh, great. Okay, thanks. So if you could stop sharing your screen and then I'll put you two up front and centre. I think we've got some questions here from everyone. Thanks so much for your questions. This is an interesting one. Isabel, Polly, how easy was it to persuade people to own up to the behaviour that they knew was wrong? You know, it seemed to be a really important part of the process of unpicking behaviours. How did you sort of get them to disclose their habits?
Well, I suppose one thing that I should have said on that was that we do a lot of work with kind of external researchers. So we're not researchers ourselves, but we work with a network of, you know, researchers with kind of various kind of specialities. And that research was all done by a really amazing research agency, you know, who specialise in that kind of thing. And I think they used all of the, you know, traditional methods to get people to own up to that. So I think their recruitment survey was actually, you know, lots of different kind of minor like naughty things that people might do, and you know they kind of hid, you know, have you ever lit a gun within that, and so they went through their own process of you know, talking to people, you know, recruiting people in a way that wouldn't you know, the kind of process of that recruitment wouldn't influence their results too much, or what they admitted to, and then, you know, going through a kind of qualitative research process, ensuring people felt kind of that they could talk about it and they weren't going to be kind of judged
a
or
safe space.
Exactly, yeah. But we didn't kind of handle that ourselves, so the kind of specifics of that I really couldn't say loads about.
Okay, great. And Rachel's got a question. How do we encourage policymakers to take on board this, this idea that providing more information and more communication doesn't necessarily lead to a change in action? So yeah, what advice can you give people who are trying to get their superiors or different people in different organisations to think we can't just do another comms campaign, we've got to look a bit deeper than this?
Well, I think probably Polly and I could probably both say something about this.
Yeah.
I think one thing to say is that that there is more and more kind of behavioural science awareness in policy making at a kind of national level. So you've got things like the Mindspace report, which I think came out it must have been about 12 years ago now, that was a kind of first attempt at kind of categorising a lot of behavioural science findings from a kind of government perspective. You've got the Behavioural Insights team, which used to be known as the Nudge Unit. So I think don't know loads about their history, but I think again they used to be a kind of government department, and I think that there is more and more of this kind of making its way into policy making. I think that a lot of it is about evidence, and not treating behavioural science as some kind of magic bullet issue that is going to kind of magically solve a lot of things. And a lot of people kind of do see it that way, which I think probably isn't helpful. But I think it can be used to kind of inform approaches that kind of create good evidence that can then be used in more influential ways. Polly, was there something you wanted to?
Yeah, I was just saying, I guess from a business point of view, I think from my experience of it, I think some of it's just been about that small little steps and that piloting piece that being able to pilot and take the results to the business and say, look, this is what the pilots have done, that then gets the buy-in from higher up levels that need to bankroll these things to go, okay, look, we can see that this is working. And I think from then looking at it from a policy point of view, we can now see that we've done this work, we've evidenced how effective it was, and that has now allowed us to work with DEFRA and with Number 10, etc., around where they're now threatening this tax, and they've set up this gum litter task force to try and get the gum cleaned up. But the results of this work, we've been able to say, well, actually, it's really important that this happens along with the cleanup, and you can't get away from those figures and the effectiveness of it.
Yeah. So I think Greg's, put a point here about measurement and how important that is. How do you decide on the metrics, and how do you really understand that measurement piece? Because I know in my work, sometimes measurement's really hard to get people to do and follow. And yeah, talk to us about measurement and how you tackle that to show and prove success.
Well, on the gum littering, you can imagine how kind of complicated it was to get people to actually rigorously and accurately and independently find out exactly how the gum rate was changing in a city centre over a period of 3+ months. Is really complicated, and we kind of we worked with a research company who developed a kind of specific methodology for doing that, which involved footfall and high-res photographs of the grounds taken at kind of regular intervals and control periods or control locations and all those kinds of things. But I think for lots of other challenges, luckily these things are kind of much simpler. For the NWG, for example, it was about the number of blockages, and that was the ultimate thing that we were trying to change. And is kind of, as we said, it's all about changing what people do rather than and kind of seeing a kind of real world impact. And I think defining how you're going to evaluate a behaviour change challenge is a really important part of the picture for us that we do at the beginning of every project. So we don't do pilots and then decide afterwards how we're going to work out if it worked or not. It needs to be built in right from the very beginning. How are we going to actually know if this has worked or not? Have we got all of the evidence and the kind of relationships and so on that we need to get that information? And that is kind of a process that we go through the entire intervention rather than just kind of tagging it on at the end.
I think interesting as well, just linked, and I noticed a question someone was saying, is there a link between cameras on high streets and people dropping gum? I think I'm right in saying this, or it might have been research from elsewhere. We've tried to catch people dropping gum, and after hours and hours and hours of having someone sat on the high street watching, they only saw one piece of gum dropped. It's one of those types of littering that is very easy to do stealthily and no one actually notices you do it. So it makes it very hard to measure it in that sense. You literally, the only way of doing it is to count what's on the floor. You can't it's very difficult to witness it actually happening. So no, cameras don't make any difference to gum littering rates.
That reminds me actually that so again with Mars Wrigley a little bit, actually it was only earlier this year actually. So we worked on a different type of littering intervention, which is looking at confectionery. So obviously Mars Wrigley also produce confectionery, which is a completely different type of littering. And in many ways, that was actually much harder to measure because obviously gum, as Polly just said, it sticks to the floor. So you actually can measure it. Confectionery is very light. It's very, it blows around in the wind. It kind of ends up in corners. And actually getting a kind of rigorous evaluation of whether or not your intervention has worked to reduce confectionery littering is really hard. And so we had to use all kinds of other methods. We had to, use perception surveys and, weigh the waste in the bins and compare it to, the amount of litter that volunteers collected and so on. And we had to use, 5 different strands of data to kind of build a picture because we couldn't measure the actual thing itself. And so I think, a lot of the time there's not necessarily a way of measuring the direct thing, but you have to do your best to kind of find other kind of options wherever possible.
Great, thank you. I'm going to put you on the spot a bit here now. So bear with me. Sid in Cyntaf Morgannwg Health Board, or maybe knows about Cyntaf Morgannwg Health Board, says that Welsh Government and 3 other local authority areas are working with residents to understand how to change behaviour in relation to COVID testing and I imagine vaccine testing. So policymakers are using these sort of techniques. I was just wondering, obviously you're experts in this area and you're seeing what's happening out there in the moment. Are there things that you think need to change about how we can encourage vaccine take-up, testing? What are some of your sort of things that you might chat to friends in a pub about that needs to change?
I mean, I feel like we could probably talk about this for days and have spent days in our office kind of talking about, COVID related behaviours. Yeah. I mean, I think initially, it felt like there was a lot of kind of very animated discussion very early on in the pandemic about the role of behaviour change and whether or not it was the kind of right approach, whether it was a kind of credible approach for kind of playing into this problem. I mean, I think just one thing that I'll kind of pick up on is that, we mentioned about testing. So I know one thing with testing is that you're supposed to kind of report your test result afterwards. And, there's millions, if not billions, of kind of missing test results in the UK. And I think that is an example of something where I think there is quite a lot of friction for people. And, I don't know if everyone's kind of aware of the concept of friction, but it's the idea that, lots of the kind of little steps and kind of faffing and kind of cognitive, having to work out different steps actually makes really changes your likelihood of doing something or not. And I think that
too much friction is about registering a test.
I think so many situations. Yeah, I mean, the leaflet that you get with COVID tests is an absolute minefield. But I think there's all sorts of kind of political issues that probably, leadership and so on. We think about kind of messengers and those kinds of things that I think also have been kind of really problematic. So I think
I hate the C for negative on the test, which I think, you sort of think C COVID. But actually, it's quite confusing. So, I think
another piece that's been interesting with the pandemic that we've talked about is around the mask wearing piece. Yeah. And something we didn't particularly touch on, but another piece you can work on is social norms, which is people will tend to do what everyone else is doing. So one of the things, I think the piece that we showed around the confectionery intervention in the park with the gnomes, that's about feeling like someone's watching you. So that's another piece that, if you feel like you're being watched, you're more likely to do the right thing. But social norms is around, doing what everyone else is doing. So we've had interventions trying to get people to recycle, and it's like, most people down your street recycle their food. And that will be like, oh, well, if everyone else is doing it, I'm going to do it. And we were talking about how difficult it's been in England. Forgive me, I can't remember whether Wales ever removed their mask wearing requirements and then put them back, but certainly in England we sort of said, no, you don't have to wear them anymore, and now we've gone back to you've got to wear them. It's very difficult to reintroduce the social norm where we were just getting to that point that it was acceptable, that's what we did, and it's very hard to keep on going backward and forward.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks so much. Anyone want to put their hand up and ask a question? How do you sort of keep abreast of the latest thinking in behavioural science? What are your sort of go-to places to find out the latest thinking or the latest case studies that you could share with our community?
Sure. I mean, we would highly recommend the website Behavioral Scientist, which has a huge amount of information on behavioral science and loads of kind of case studies from all over the world on all sorts of different topics, and a lot of them are from a more kind of policy based angle as well. So that is a really great resource. But I mean, there's all sorts of, you know, networks out there, and I mean, in some ways it can feel like, you know, there are a lot of kind of big names in behavioral science that kind of that you kind of hear again and again. So there's you know, there's quite a lot of kind of new books that can't kind of come out. But yeah, we could definitely put together a bit of a list of resources and share them afterwards.
I was going to say, I noticed early on in the talk, someone was asking about like what would our recommended reading be. There's probably a few books that I can think of. Something like Predictionally Irrational was one of the first books I read when I joined Behaviour Change, and that gave a really good insight into how people are predictably irrational. And
thank you. Richard, you've got a question.
Morning. Yeah, thanks for the talk. It was really interesting to hear examples. I was interested, just your impact seemed huge in terms of your percentages, 65% for littering and littering gum, and then 50% for the blockages. And I wondered whether you've done anything over a longer period of time. I imagine there's kind of an instant impact and then a drop. And I wonder whether you have any, whether there was any push to look at it over the longer term, and whether you have any additional evidence about do people kind of get used to that messaging and therefore it becomes less effective? So does novelty needs to be repeated?
Sure. Well, so on the gum littering specifically, I can't remember exactly how this was done because this was kind of a little bit before my time, but I think there were kind of longer term measurements taken, and it found that if you combine those gum littering interventions with cleaning the streets, actually the impact is actually sustained over a year rather than 3 months. I think one other thing about, so I was actually the other day I was reading, there's a great report by Richard Carmichael on kind of behaviour change and kind of public policy for climate change. And in that he talks about the issue of evidence with behaviour change. I think because a lot of these things are really hard to evaluate, actually getting those longer term measurements is really hard a lot of the time. And actually there's not, as far as we know, there's not actually a lot of evidence necessarily showing kind of really long term kind of impact because it's quite hard to measure. And you know, our kind of projects with clients tend to be relatively you know, we tend not to have, you know, years worth of kind of follow-up kind of measurements built into those projects. So we're kind of, you know, very lucky that, you know, with Mars, for example, we've been doing that work for, you know, 6 years, so we do have a bit more of a long-term picture, but I wouldn't say that, you know, I think that is definitely something that would be kind of interesting to know more about.
Thanks,
Richard. Armanac, sorry if I've said your name incorrectly.
Hello, yeah, it was correct. It's Armanac. Thank you very much. Thank you for the very interesting presentation. I'm actually a behavioral economist myself at Cardiff Business School, working on real-world policy questions as you are doing. And one of the questions I had was actually about your measurement and the way you kind of run your studies. Are you doing randomized controlled trials where you have a control group and some treatment groups? Or do you have some other identification strategies like difference in difference studies, so far, so forth? So what is the main methodology behind the results that you were showing to us? Thank you very much.
Thanks. So, I mean, the short answer is kind of no, we don't tend to do RCTs. That's kind of generally kind of out of our scope. We tend to, our kind of process is very much about coming up with ideas and then kind of piloting them in the real world kind of as early as we can. And we do kind of use often, you know, control measures, so like control locations or control groups to do that. But we kind of RCTs are a little bit kind of out of our scope. So again, we're kind of testing ideas, usually on quite a small scale, and then if we can kind of prove that they work there, then we'll kind of try and then kind of scale them up for greater impact.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, like with the gum littering, we'll put signages up. We did one in City of London, and you know, various different areas. Some areas have got signage, and then a completely separate area we put nothing up, but we'll measure the gum littering in that area so that we can see, you know, we can check that our measurements are actually making sense.
Thank you. Andrew.
Yes, good morning. A very interesting topic. As you're in the sort of behavioural change stroke consultancy business, I'd be interested in your perception of what the benefits and disbenefits of a not-for-profit organisation is.
Thanks. Yeah, really interesting question. I mean, I suppose that I think, you know, for us, we work kind of solely on social and environmental challenges, and I think the fact that we're not a commercial entity, I think means that, you know, we're not doing projects where there is a kind of purely kind of profit making approach. And I think, you know, sometimes I would say if we're working with local authorities, for example, that is potentially kind of helpful from a kind of political perspective. I'd kind of speculate, you know, to be working with an organisation that is not kind of profit making and profit driven in that sense. I don't know if you had anything to add, Polly, on that.
No. I mean, I think from an employee point of view, being employed for a not-for-profit, it's nice, you know, and we can be choiceful. We are choiceful around the work we do. You know, had Mars come to us and said we want to sell more gum, we would have just been, no, we're not helping you do that. That's not what we're there for. And I think it helps you then, you know, work in that sense that you work on projects that you know are doing good. Yeah.
Brilliant. And can you give us any sort of little insights into some exciting projects that you're working on at the moment, or are they all top secret at the moment?
Well, we've got quite a lot of kind of exciting projects on the go at the moment. I mean, I'm working quite heavily on kind of you know, kind of climatey type things. So we're doing quite a lot of, you know, looking at what kind of behaviour changes we're going to need in the kind of long term to get to net zero, which is such a fascinating area. So I'm really enjoying that. Yeah, we're always quite a wide range going on at the moment.
There is a lot.
Yeah,
it's difficult to say stuff without naming
the
areas that we're working with, but yes, we are very busy at the moment, it must be said.
Yeah, and I think you've done such a fantastic job for us today. You might get a few more requests from this breakfast briefing. So thank you so much. It's such an amazingly interesting area. I love behavioural science. I love looking at things in that deeper way to really get underneath how people behave and how they act, and to make meaningful, purposeful actions that make a difference. So really, really fascinating. Thanks so much, Polly and Isabel. Thanks everyone for joining us. Thanks for participating. It really means a lot to us. We're going to send an email out with all of your contact details. We'll put in a list of all the fabulous links that we've shared with you today. So thanks ever so much for joining us, and watch out for the new year for our next round of breakfast briefing sessions. Thanks everyone. Cheers.